Thank you for joining us today for the latest in the Masterclass series. The Masterclass series is a joint venture between the UK Commission and Blake's, which is the research centre at the Institute for Education. In the past we've had sessions on skills demand, historical and comparative perspectives on VET, global challenges to HE, so it's quite a broad spectrum. Our last session that we did roughly a month ago looked at the long-term training trend. So this is the latest session, and it's focusing on apprenticeship and occupations, I'm sure you're aware. The masterclasses are quite unique, I suppose, because we like to think that they give access to the latest research and the leading thinkers in topics on VET. So it's quite important, and our partnership with Lakes really helps us to do that. So we access their staff, their researchers, and also their wider networks as well. So it doesn't just draw on Lakes staff, it's much wider than that. And the session that we had on global challenges to HE a few months ago in the spring really emphasises that point, I think, because we managed to bring David Feingold across from the US to talk to us on that point. So it's quite a wide-ranging series of topics, really. So today's session, we're joined by Alison Fuller, so we're really pleased that Alison could make it today. Alison's going to talk to us about apprenticeship and occupation. Now, Alison's really well placed and very well regarded in her field. She's got a research background that spans over 3 decades. And she's, sorry, I don't mean that.
You say that.
I mean that to establish your kind of
I was very young.
prowess. But yes, it's a real pleasure to have Alison here today. I think it's a really interesting topic because apprenticeship, the importance of apprenticeship has obviously risen over recent years. It's become much more popular. Across the political spectrum, there's a kind of willingness and emphasis on apprenticeship. But that's to kind of create some sort of parity of esteem between the academic route and the vocational route, so that's really important. But I think there's still some way to go, because we were looking at some stats internally in the Commission recently. And at level 3, there's 22 academic starts, or A-level starts, for every 1 apprenticeship start. And at level 4, the gap's even bigger, so it's like 90 academic starts at undergraduate level to every 1 apprenticeship start. So there's a long way to go before that parity of esteem is really achieved. But Alison's going to speak to us for about 35 to 40 minutes today on apprenticeship and occupation. So I'll hand over to Alison.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. Just tell me if you can't hear me at the back, and I'll speak up. So, as Richard says, apprenticeship is a very live and topical area of public policy. I think anyone who was following the party conference season, can't fail to have heard announcements on apprenticeship, from every party, and a bit of an arms race with regard to numbers that each of the parties was committing to try and support. In my view, that was disappointing, because I think in the recent years, and I'll say more about this, but in the last year or 2, there has been a huge effort to try and concentrate on quality rather than quantity. And I think this debate about the relationship between apprenticeship and the concept of occupation is really, a strong part of that debate. The inspiration for this paper and for starting to think about this really was a project which the Gatsby Foundation funded a year or 2 ago now, and Daniel's in the audience, Daniel Sanford-Smith. And Gatsby commissioned Lorna Unwin and I to look at this relationship and to think about it historically and across England and Germany. So there's a report that we produced as the outcome of that project, and I brought some hard copies along. If people are interested, they can take those away, or it's available online as a PDF as well. So that was really just by way of initial introduction. So I think you'll all be aware that apprenticeship, is sitting there amongst various discourses, often competing discourses. It often seems to be the kind of programme or concept that's required to address a whole number of policy aims, and therefore does seem to get stretched rather in terms of its definition. And I just picked out a few here. So apprenticeship is positioned as part of national VET systems in this country, just as in many other countries, and therefore it's alongside other routes for young people, and in the case of the UK, and England in particular, adults right up the age scale, as a sort of mechanism for their training and their scaffolding into the labour market. As Richard said, in England, apprenticeship is actually a very small route for school leavers. So we reckon it's about 6% of 16 to 18-year-olds will start a government-supported apprenticeship. Now that compares unfavourably to the countries that are considered to be the very strong apprenticeship countries, such as Germany or Switzerland or Austria, for example, where it's much nearer to 50%. 50, yeah. Between sort of 40 and just over 50. In fact, it's come down a bit in Germany, but nonetheless, it's a very important and large route, and in that sense, the kind of basis for people having a stake in it is distributed quite widely, because everybody will know somebody who's an apprentice and a family who's an apprentice. So it's not such an unusual route. Hands up here, anyone that knows an apprentice personally in their social networks? Yeah. Well, more than the average. My oldest son was an apprentice, so I also feel I can hold my hand up and say that too. So apprenticeship, I think that Lorna and I would say, can be considered in two ways, both as an institution, so a set of institutional arrangements that are specifically designed to fulfil policy goals, such as supporting the youth transition from school to work and from unskilled to skilled. But also it can be seen more broadly and more generically as a model of learning. So we do talk about apprenticeship as a model of learning which is applicable to surgeons, musicians, chefs, hairdressers, the whole range, but really applicable where there's quite a lot to be learned. And I'll come back to that. It is also seen increasingly as a part of debate about higher education. So is apprenticeship an alternative to higher education? Is it a pathway to higher education? And how does it sit alongside the higher education offer? And again, I think politicians are increasingly wanting to see apprenticeship as a viable and well-regarded alternative for young people, to them simply going straight through the school into full-time university bachelor's degrees. And in the last 3 years, I think it was about 3 years ago, they developed what they call a higher apprenticeship, which is delivering qualifications at level 4 and above, so first year of higher education and above. So that whole debate is really quite important, I think. In other countries, higher education apprenticeship is not positioned really as an alternative to higher education. It's positioned in its own kind of box as leading to skilled employment in protected occupations, and I'll come back to that. So I think there are big advantages in that kind of strong route and having a strong safety net around that. The disadvantage is that it lacks permeability. And we have a tradition in this country of a more permeable system. So people can move in and out of different pathways, perhaps more easily than they can in other countries. So we also need to keep that in mind if we're thinking about system design. So just to put some statistics on the table and to paint a broad sort of picture of what it looks like in this country. This is starts. These are from the most recent full-year figures in England, 12-13, of apprenticeship starts. And the figures come ultimately from the individual learner record, but are presented, they're publicly available through the FE data library if people want to look at apprenticeship statistics. So we've got over 500,000 all-age starts in 12-13, and as you can see from this, the really interesting thing is the size of the 25+ age group. So around about 2005-06, the then government decided to make apprenticeship, the government-supported apprenticeship, an all-age programme and make funding available. And then in 2010, I think it was, when the coalition government came in, they rebranded Train to Gain, which was the non-apprenticeship scheme, as apprenticeship. That's not quite fair. It wasn't it wasn't just a rebranding. It was obviously bringing that programme into line with apprenticeship. But nonetheless, that gave a significant boost to the numbers. So you can see from that the under-19 group, so the traditional school leaver group, was only 22% of all apprenticeship starts. So gender. So traditionally, apprenticeship has been more a scheme or a programme for young males than young females, with the exception of hairdressing. But you can see here with the programme being all age that's changed. So as you get apprentices starting older at the age scale, they're more likely to be female. And even in the under-19 group, nearly half now are female. So the younger the apprentices start, the more likely they are to be male. The older they start, the more likely they are to be female. So if we look at level, so the programme in this country is segmented by level, which again sets us apart from our European neighbours on this. So the programme is available at level 2, which in labour market terms, as you'll know, is equivalent to semi-skilled kind of level, and in educational terms it is equivalent to GCSE passes. So it's available at level 2, it's available at level 3, so kind of skilled level in the labour market or A-level equivalent, and it's now available at level 4+. But if you look at it, the majority of apprentices in England start at level 2, rather than level 3, which would be the normal kind of level in other countries. And if you're thinking about the younger starts, then they're more likely, much more likely to be starting level 2 than the older starts. And I think that's quite interesting as we go forward and start thinking about apprenticeship reform, whether there really is an argument for having apprenticeships at level 2 if they do map on to semi-skilled levels within the labour market. Is there enough to be learned to achieve competence at level 2 for it to count as a meaningful occupational journey, if you like? I think you might be able to read those. This is the sort of top 10. I thought you might be interested in if you're not as familiar with the statistics as I am. I'm not quite so much of an anorak. So these are the top 10 sectors in terms of popularity of starts in 12-13. So as you can see, way out in front is health and social care. But I think what's very interesting about this is the preponderance of service sectors in the top 10, whereas historically you would have seen engineering and construction up there. And also the appearance of some slightly odd ones, like management. I think if you ask the public what they would call to mind if they were thinking about an apprentice, they would still be thinking about apprentices, pursuing skilled trades or skilled occupations at that kind of intermediate level. I think they might struggle with the idea of an apprenticeship in management, but nonetheless you see it here at number 3. Customer service as well, clearly that's an aspect of people's jobs across a whole range of sectors and occupations, but to see it as an apprenticeship in its own right is also quite a challenging idea, I think. So it's not until you get towards the bottom that you get some of the traditional ones appearing, like hairdressing and engineering. If you look at the top 10 for under-19s, as opposed to all age, you see a slightly more traditional picture in that engineering and construction and hairdressing come much higher, so construction's in there, but you still get the service sector dominating. So the question now is the pattern changing? So that was the most recent full year for which we've got statistics on apprenticeship starts. This is the most recent, so this is 13-14, August to April provisional figures. And it's quite interesting, you're beginning to see a little bit of a change, and why that is we can discuss. But just in terms of the broad percentage, we can see that the 16 to 18s have gone up to 30% now, from 22% in those figures that I showed you from last year. And the 25 plus have dropped from 45 down to 32. So this is just the percentage of all starts. And the 19 to 24s have gone up significantly as well. So, you know, something's happened in the kind of levers that are helping to steer some of these numbers to start bringing about some change here. I think funding is an important part of that. There's also been a big push on trying to generate more apprenticeships for younger people, and mechanisms such as employer grants have been brought in to encourage employers to take them up for the 24 and under group, apparently with some success. However, overall, it's not clear that the numbers are going to reach the heights that they did the year before, so there's also perhaps something here about numbers beginning to plateau or even go down, which may be partly what was prompting the political leaders to trumpet again the numbers game. But it's a big decision for politicians to make. You know, are they going to keep pushing for numbers, or are they going to bite the bullet on quality? So, I think another challenge for apprenticeship is the shape of our economy and the profile of our economy. So, apprenticeship traditionally has been positioned as an intermediate programme to generate and lead to intermediate level skills, so skilled level jobs between the semi-skilled and the graduate. And historically that worked quite well because we had a large manufacturing sector, a larger construction sector, and we didn't have quite this shape in our economy where we have bulges at the top and bulges at the bottom. So there's a challenge for apprenticeship just in terms of what the economy looks like now, which might also help to explain those level 2 figures and the kind of policy decision to bring level 2 in. That's just the background really. But now I want to go back a little bit and start thinking about apprenticeship and occupation and where this sort of comes from. I think historically apprenticeship was strongly aligned with the concept of occupation in this country. There was an idea that it was leading to a skilled level of employment with some kind of premium attached to it, and that generally it was associated with what we might call an occupational labour market structure or an external labour market, whereby if you went through the apprenticeship training, the recognised apprenticeship training, and achieved the outcomes, it was a portable currency. You could take that across employers geographically and so on and so forth. So in engineering, if you achieved the relevant qualification, you could work for the engineer in Birmingham or in Liverpool or in Milton Keynes or wherever. So historically we've got a strong link between apprenticeship and occupation. But the advent of state involvement in apprenticeship, which really only started strongly in the early to mid-1990s under the then Conservative government, we see some change happening. So prior to then, apprenticeship was still a private arrangement between employers and individuals with providers, educational providers, providing the off-the-job and so on. But with the advent of state involvement, we saw the beginnings of an organisation around sectors as opposed to occupations. And apprenticeship, and I guess this is largely for accountability reasons, was sort of designed and constructed around sets of qualifications. So the advent of apprenticeship as a framework which contained a basket of awards was born and became the kind of metric which could then be measured in terms of completion. Have participants in this framework achieved the required qualifications at the end? So apprenticeship started to evolve as a kind of wrapper concept around awards, and the learning process and the what's to be learned bit of this story started to take second place. And therefore the kind of challenge to the alignment of apprenticeship and occupation started to fracture and fray. it's interesting when you go back to the 1994 and the advent of modern apprenticeship and the kind of reasons for that. You know, you see it being brought in as a response to concerns about the UK's competitive position and its ability to compete with other countries, particularly in the skilled areas. So initially, apprenticeship was only brought in as a level 3 programme, which is quite interesting given that it's now shifted to being mainly a level 2 programme. But at the same time, it was extended the modern apprenticeship away from just these traditional occupations to right across the economy. So the bringing in of apprenticeships in service sectors started with the government involvement. And again, I think indirectly started to have a process of detachment of apprenticeship from the concept of occupation. So we had apprenticeships being introduced in areas of the economy where there was no tradition of that, and it wasn't clear what the training pathway was. However, some qualifications were developed and a framework, and so it came into the scheme, numbers were counted, and these things start to gain their own momentum. So when Lorna and I started to look at this, we'd always start with the simple way. We went to the dictionary and started looking things up. And one of the things that really strikes you is the terminology. It's not clear. There's lots of overlapping terminology. People use different words to mean the same things. These words can mean the same things. So essentially you've got words like craft, you've got words like job, occupation and trade. And when you look in the dictionary, it's quite hard to sort of pull them apart. So quite elastic terminologies and quite confusing, I think. So I went back to Braverman, writing in the early 1970s about craft, and I think this is a really interesting quotation from Braverman. So Braverman's interested in skilled craft and the undermining of those crafts with technology coming in and so on, and what's going to happen to these crafts. And this description really of what he conceived to be a craft, or we might say an occupation, I think is really powerful. It picks up the notion of time, so it talks about years of an apprenticeship that were needed. It talks about it being a learning process that extends into working life, into the part of your working life where you are competent. It talks about knowledge, it talks about judgment. It likens learning to be a skilled, having occupational expertise to being a professional, or having so there's a kind of substance to this definition which I think is quite helpful when we're trying to think about what an occupation might be, and therefore why it might be different to, for example, a job role. And then looking at Linda Clark's work, she's written quite a lot about this. She very much contrasts the concept of job with occupation. I think this comes strongly from her comparative work, particularly looking at contrasts between Germany and England. And she, nails the colours to the mast and says that job's got a much more limited meaning than the concept of occupation. Occupation is much more encompassing, it's more holistic. And then if you go to the German, the concept of Beruf takes that a stage further, really, by saying that a Beruf is something which is about an occupation for life. It's very much a concept which takes into it occupational identity, and it applies across the hierarchy of occupations, from crafts to professions. So the Germans have a concept of Beruf which is quite helpful, and which also underpins their approach to apprenticeship as well. So a more ambitious concept of what this thing is. If you look back though to the 1990s, just at the time when the Conservatives were bringing in the modern apprenticeship scheme, people like Robert Wright were talking about a post-occupational society. So they were saying, actually, with globalisation, with information and communication technologies, global movement of labour and so on, it's not clear what the role of occupations is anymore, and as a device for organising vet systems, has it lost its meaning? So he talked about a post-occupational. He talked about different ways of categorising work across the economy and across levels, and essentially said there were just 3 types. There were routine production services, so people who do routine jobs on production lines, for example. There are personal services, where you're hair and beauty or healthcare or whatever, and then what he called symbolic analytic services, which was really the kind of holy grail, and this was the kind of idea that really fed into the expansion of higher education across the advanced Western countries and also, as we know, across many other countries too. So the idea that it was about the ability to conceptualise, analyse, add value that was important as a sort of generic capacity rather than specific occupational knowledge and skills. So I think from the perspective of 2014, that all sounds a bit premature. But nonetheless, the extent to which we've got a strong concept of occupation does vary from country to country. And that depends on a whole range of historical and cultural factors, the extent to which institutions have become mature and established, and the architecture and arrangements between them are in place. Depends on the industrial profile. So if you go back to Germany, for example, they still have a strong small to medium enterprise component to their economy and a very strong manufacturing sector. Depends on the way the labour market's organised, what kind of labour market types you have in place. So in this country we have strong secondary labour markets, we have flexibility, we have a smaller section of the economy which is based on this idea of an occupational labour market. Depends on how legalised and regulated the labour market is, to what extent are occupations open to people, or to what extent are they limited to who can do them by the kind of education and training pathway that they've completed. So all sorts of differences. And that then takes us into the kind of current. A couple of years ago, maybe it's 3 years ago, when Doug Richards started his review, it was in the wake of complaints and concerns about the quality of apprenticeships and the continuing expansion of the programme, potentially without safeguards in terms of its ability to deliver the kind of benefits that would be expected from a publicly funded programme. So he was asked to have a look at this and come up with a serious review that would perhaps take us forward to the next chapter in the history of publicly funded and public policy oriented apprenticeship. So the world that he was looking at was a world in which apprenticeships divided up into different levels, level 2, 3, 4 plus, where the frameworks are an umbrella for a whole range of things. So there's about 170 frameworks. Actually, there's more than that. There's only about 170 or so which are live, i.e. you've got participants. And if you look into them, they're divided in terms of pathways. They're divided in terms of types of qualification. They're divided in terms of the amount of time that is associated with completing, as specified by guided learning hours. They contain myriad job roles and job titles. Quite a messy picture, and the report that we did for Gatsby kind of outlines some of that. So we have within that, these 170 sector frameworks, well over 1,500 job roles. And this is where you really see the concept that's taken hold, or had taken hold in public policy, associating apprenticeship with a job role, rather than with an occupation. So what you've got is rather a fragmented, segmented picture, very limited standardisation, so very difficult to say level 3 apprenticeship in one particular part of the economy or the occupational world is the same as a level 3 in another, because the outcomes could be very different in terms of qualification currency, in terms of the experience, in terms of the length, and so on and so forth. And you do see then this kind of real fracture between the concept of apprenticeship and occupation. So So that was the world that Richard was looking at. And I just want, by way of two very brief little case studies before I finish, to illustrate some of this. So we looked at, actually in another project for Gatsby, we looked at dental technicians. Dental technicians are really interesting. These are the people that make braces, they make the moulds for crowns, they make dentures and so on and so forth. So dental technicians is a really interesting one. It's an established occupation, and there are various hallmarks that kind of back that up. So it's in a family of occupations which are regulated by the General Dental Council. It's a registered occupation. In other words, you can't practice it unless you've been through an approved education and training pathway, which is only approved by the GDC, and you've got therefore a protected title. So not anybody can do it. When we talked to dental technicians and dental technician educators, they were very clear that there was a very strong occupational identity associated with being a dental technician, which was both very technical but was also aesthetic and was also about craft and art. So it was really interesting. They were able to articulate that, very impressively. So at the end of this, you have very clear currency. You have an outcome which leads to registration. You have a license to practice. You have portability. You also, because of the nature of the qualification that's attached to this education and training pathway, have a strong currency for progression to higher education because of the UKCES credits that are associated with the qualification. So you could say that it's got both high use value and high exchange value. High use value in that you're really trained to do the job through work-based placements, experience, assessment in the workplace, as well as theoretical training. But it's also something which you can use as a platform for further educational progression as well. However, it isn't a government-supported framework. When we asked why, we were told it was too big. We do that for a moment. Then you get healthcare support. So this is the area where we've seen such huge numbers growing. So we're moving from a strong occupational concept with all those hallmarks around the dental technician to what I would term a much weaker concept here with healthcare support. And how do we know that, or how can we kind of analyse that, and what are the clues? So it's not a registered occupation. There's no standard qualification. There's a whole myriad of qualifications within the frameworks. The process, if you like, and the choice of those qualifications is locally determined. An individual employer will decide. They'll decide what their healthcare support workers do in their particular hospital, for example, and it might not be the same as the hospital in the next town. So there's very little standardisation. There's no kind of collective agreement about what that occupation is. If you look at the qualifications in this basket, this framework basket, they have very limited currency for progression for higher education. So they won't carry UKCES points, those qualifications. They don't allow somebody who's gained that qualification at level 3 to use that to then move on and cross the divide into a registered healthcare occupation. So you might say they've got very high use value. I mean, the healthcare workers will be being trained to do the job in that hospital, but not such high exchange value. Where do you go with that? So in terms of our concept of occupation, I think we could perhaps agree that it's a much weaker concept, but a very big government-supported apprenticeship framework, in fact, the biggest. So post-reform, what have we got? Is there a strengthening of the concept of occupation following the Richard Review and various other work that's gone on since? Well, first of all, he made a very strong statement that not everything is an apprenticeship, which is a pretty good starting point, I think. And said, okay, so training's great, reskilling's great, even upskilling's great, but is everything actually an apprenticeship? Let's think hard, more clearly about that. So he talked about the idea of an apprenticeship standard. What should the apprentice be able to do at the end of a process of education and training, and that the employer would recognise? How can we develop that standard so that there's one standard for one occupation rather than kind of having competing things going on? So So that was some of the thinking that went into the Richard Review, which set this hair running of apprenticeship reform quite strongly, and gave rise in the government's response to this, in terms of wanting to change things, to the concept of trailblazers. So the trailblazers have been set up as a vehicle for employers coming together to co-determine what the apprenticeship standards should be in occupations of relevance to their industry. The little HM government quotation there. So it's about the employers coming together. They can bring in professional bodies to help them if they so wish, to develop a shared understanding of what an occupation might be. And there you get the difficulty. We want them to be set at a more general level, but not too general a level. So we don't want, the kind of message is, we don't want to go down Robert Wright's line, kind of go too broad, but not too specific. And of course that's difficult. It's difficult. How do you find that midpoint? Create a right balance. So there's been a whole range of trailblazers who've been grappling with this in different phases. I think we're on to our third phase now. Yeah, Anna's nodding. So I just wanted to give a quick example. Again, all this information is actually available on the apprenticeship.org website. So if you take aerospace manufacturing fitter, so this is maybe it's a more traditional kind of apprenticeship sector. It's one where you would expect an occupational labour market to be operating, because you don't want people kind of fetching up and being aerospace fitters without having some kind of approved training. So this is what they've come up with. They say it should be at least 3 years, which is a considerable length of time, indicating there's a lot to be learned. They're also indicating that there should be an off-the-job phase at the beginning, where apprentices are learning hand skills and health and safety and how to behave and so on. And then there should be an extended development phase, which is work-based. Big focus on endpoint assessment, where the test will be whether they can demonstrate the competencies that are encompassed by the standard. And then the employer will sign it off and say this person's competent. So the idea is that the recognition for that education and training will be in the fact that they've done a recognised pathway, that the apprentices have completed a recognised pathway of education and training, and it may well be endorsed by third parties. And in this case, there's a specific link with a professional body and being able to register on the first rung of the professional ladder. The apprenticeship standard is set at level 3, so broadly equivalent to A levels. And essentially we can see that it will have high use value. It's a lengthy education and training pathway that's being proposed. It should have high exchange value for the occupation, because it's been agreed by the employers. So they should think, well, if somebody's completed this standard, down the road, they'll be the same as the person that's done it up in the North of England or South of England or whatever. However, there's a decoupling going on from the standard, the learning outcomes, and qualification. And this is an area, I think, it's quite a grey and ambiguous area at the moment in the reform agenda and the way the reforms are playing out. So you might say with this one that got high use value, high exchange value for occupational portability, but actually in terms of exchange value for educational progression, much less clear. It's not clear what the qualification is that the individual is going to graduate with. So just to conclude, I think the early evidence from the published standards indicate that there's an attempt to include a variety of features which are leading us perhaps to thinking that we've got a strengthening of the concept between apprenticeship and occupation embedded within all this work that's going on. So you get an occupational title when you look at the standards, but of course we don't have the kind of same legal regulatory framework around occupations across the economy that mean that these titles are protected. Some are, but most aren't. You've got a kind of narrative description of the role, knowledge and skills requirements, so there's a sort of sense in which people are actually developing a shared understanding of what's involved. Getting a clear specification of length, which is way beyond the minimum which was set in the statutory underpinnings of the government-supported programme, which is only a year, as you all know. There's not that information still, though, on inputs, on what the processes are, the balance between on and off the job, and so on and so forth. There's an encouragement to link to registration, but again, it's not a requirement, and again, because this is across the economy and we don't have these kind of arrangements in place right across the economy, it's going to be patchy. And we have this thing about the tension between the standard and the qualification. So attaining the standard is not the same as attaining the qualification. And I think if we're talking about young people, we should really be thoughtful about this. It's all very well for people to talk about the development of a standard and employers agreeing it and so on and so forth. But if we're talking about young people who may change their mind in the future and so on and so forth, then, you know, are we being a little bit careless not to really be thinking hard about the qualification aspect of this as well? The majority of the trailblazers are at level 3+. So again, there does seem to be an attempt to, in this pause, to rethink government-supported apprenticeship. There does seem to be an attempt to actually think, what are the occupations here? What's the occupational journey? What's the end point? And actually, what's the skilled position? But nobody said it's the end of level 2. And if you look down the list, there are some sort of level 2 proposals creeping in. So I think overall we've got a strengthening through the reform programme of the link between apprenticeship and occupation, and personally I welcome that. But it's not as tight as it might be. There's quite a lot of wiggle room still. And then the other thing for policymakers to really think about and grapple with is, this is going to lead to a drop in numbers. Given the party competences and people and the leaders still pinning their hats to numbers, is there going to be a battle ahead? What's going to happen? Thanks very much.
Alison, thank you. That's a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. We've got just less than 15 minutes for questions, so happy to take your questions now. If you could just start your question with your name and where you're from, that'd be really great.
Dan Hooper from the Federation of Small Businesses. Really good presentation, Alison. Just picking up on that final point, like you see the drop in numbers, our research tells us that if they change the current system, then we're more likely to see less small businesses taking on apprentices, which, to be honest, is kind of not really, I think there aren't enough small businesses taking more in the first place, and we want to try and increase that. But when you say the sort of drop in numbers, where do you see the fault lines for that? I mean, is it communication? Is it funding reform? Is it to do with the change in emphasis from government or different governments on the amount of funding they're putting in at different stages of it? But all the research, when you look at all of those, suggests dropping numbers, but I'd be interested to see your thoughts about what areas of that particular point we need to target.
Okay, well, the reason for the big numbers is the conversion of existing employees to apprentices. So, and that, of course, the older you are at the age scale, the more likely they are to bring existing employees. So, kind of at a stroke, you know, you were able to get numbers. So that's, you know, so that's, you know, because it was relatively easy. So what the big challenge is, how do you get kind of genuine numbers, particularly in the younger age groups? And then there's the question about incentives. I think there's a general kind of wariness of employers to hire 16, 17-year-olds, and 18-year-olds, because things have moved on and people are worried about having young people in the workplace. There's kind of there's less experience of having young people in the workplace than there was, you know, 3 decades ago, when many more young people went straight into work. So I think there's some reticence on the part of employers to have young people in the workplace. And that might be because they're concerned about behaviour or health and safety or insurance or whatever it might be. And then on the education side, you've got all the drivers trying to keep young people in educational institutions. So there's a big issue about, you know, young people being made fully aware of what other options might be post-16. See, the raising of the participation age, you know, is directing more young people to stay and full-time and so on and so forth. So you've got employers, kind of having lost a little bit the ability to, be confident about taking young people on, and the education sector having all its incentives about keeping young people in the education sector. So there's big problems there. So is money the answer? Well, I guess it can be part of the answer, but it's probably not all of the answer. It's about culture, it's about support. So in terms of the small employers, the kind of most effective mechanism that we've come across is the group training associations, as a way of helping smaller employers to be involved, but helping to mitigate the risk, of a single employer taking on, an apprentice. And in terms of a learning experience for apprentices, there's a lot to be said for them being in a kind of group rather than just being on their own in a small employer, because there's a chance to share and what have you.
So obviously the finance is a short-term fix, but what's needed is a culture change to embed that into the mindset.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's not sustainable.
It's not easy, and other countries find it difficult too. It's not just us. And you look at other countries, the starting age of apprentices is going up in other countries as well. I think it's well over 19 now in Germany, the start. So it's not just us, and we do have lots of good practice. So yeah.
There's a couple of questions. So we go for Chris first.
So as the Institute for Employment Research, I've got 4 comments and questions, but I'll just do 2 now. If you've got time, come back to this. And the first one is about the qualification stacking that you flag here, which is that you go level 2 and then you do level 3. And in one sense, when we talk about parity of esteem, that becomes problematic, because when you enter higher education, you don't start at level 2 then progress to level 4. You go in and you're doing a degree, so that impacts upon the parity of esteem. But it also means, from some of the work that we've been doing, Daniel talked to Daniel about this, when we've been going to colleges, level 2 is still being used to absorb less work capable youth. I'm choosing my words carefully there. So in other words, people in the past who might have gone into apprenticeships, kind of bright working class, are not doing that. So there's a real bifurcation. There is a stigma attached to it. It's kind of second chance issue. So there's kind of 2 things going on there with branch stacking. One is weak esteem attached to level 2, and even when you go through level 2, level 3 routes, the requirement on young people in FE to do something they're not required to do in H. And the second point is about, it's a phrase you use, and I don't know whether you use this as a slip of the tongue, but the lack of collective agreement around qualifications. I just want to know what your thoughts are on that, because it strikes me that when you talk about occupational identity, which is what apprenticeships were, that occupational identity in Britain, at least in the 70s, became conflated with trade union identity. And so the weakness of apprenticeships has coincided with trade unions being rolled back, and so recreating occupational identity, some people would fear that recreates trade union identity. And at the same time, as part of the weakness of lack of collectivity, as you say here, the state has abdicated some responsibility for not protecting titles. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on the lack of collectivity around apprenticeships in the UK. Maybe see that as a weakness, or actually you see that as part of the flexibility.
Right. So, just a couple of things. The first thing is that there's no guarantee that people will progress from level 2 to level 3 to so, and that is a problem with this design of the existing system. So, you can complete your level 2, but there's no, even if you complete it really, well, there's no guarantee you'll go on to a level 3. So there's a progression problem. In terms of the collective, I wasn't particularly thinking about the union point, but what I was thinking about was a collective without a capital C, agreement without a capital A, about what constitutes an occupation. And from employers' point of view, and I've heard and read about this in terms of colleagues in other parts of Europe, the advantage, I don't know if people know this, the advantage is that a pool of skilled labour is created that then employers can have confidence in and that they can dip into. So there's less of a concern about free rider problems and poaching, because the pool is being created through collective effort and collective buy-in to to generating and supporting the delivery of these skills into the labour market. So I think it's, for me, it's that's the appeal of the collective approach, is about building trust, about building confidence, about building shared understanding of what the education system through apprenticeship is providing and how employers are contributing to that. In terms of the union aspect to that, you're right that there was that going on in the 1970s, but in terms of union involvement now, it's quite limited, and you might argue that actually there was an opportunity to bring it back in. So at the moment the unions aren't involved in the Trailblazers, for example, and you know, it's a different world. So the union, the TUC, is very, very positive about apprenticeship. So you know, and has been doing good work in terms of, you know, apprenticeship pay and things like that. So I don't know whether we run the same risks, but you're right that it would ring alarm bells in some quarters.
Keith Brooke from Sector Team. Is there anything for us to learn from Germany, or is it too late? And presumably Germany's changing with the changing shape of the economy. And also, what about China? I mean, China, presumably they haven't needed apprenticeships if there's very low skilled jobs, but are they moving in that direction? And you know, is there a need in China?
Yeah, well,
Asia?
it's interesting in Germany in that actually they have got apprenticeships across the economy. So it's, you know, they have apprenticeships in sales, for example, banking, and various things. So even, you know, as their industrial profile obviously will change, they have got an embedded concept of apprenticeship being across the economy. They also have and you know, maybe this will break down, maybe it won't, but they also have wage premia attached to apprenticeship occupations. So the skills bring back those returns, and that's argued the advantages of that are argued in terms of productivity. So I don't see any in the papers I've read and the discussions I've had with colleagues, I don't see a big threat to the apprenticeship system. Indeed, I see concerns that it needs to be nurtured and looked after, because the main worry that they have is changing aspirations of young people and their families. So more young people wanting to, you know, to get bachelor degrees and so on and so forth. So they have the development of what they call hybrid routes and dual qualification, whereby increasingly young people are getting both an apprenticeship and you know, a bachelor degree, and taking, you know, many years to make those kinds of transitions. And you're seeing that in other countries as well, Denmark, Switzerland, Canada as well. So I think in the kind of economic environment, young people and their families are thinking hard about how to, well, I'm not sure they're explicitly thinking about this, but the statistics suggest that the patterns are becoming more hybrid. So as a way of hedging, it makes sense to get a vocational training and to get a high level educational qualification. So I don't think that there's, you know, there's kind of a huge risk there. In China, I know less about the Chinese situation, so I'd have to find out. I mean, the noise is that they're very interested in apprenticeship, and I know that the Germans have been, you know, going out there in numbers to try and help them develop systems, but I'm not quite sure what their numbers look like and quite how that's developed. Others may know more.
So it sounds like Germany's got that, you were talking about the high exchange value and the high use value. So it sounds like Germany's got that high exchange value.
Well, I think it's a bit more like, no, I think they've got high up, no, I think that's the concern about if I were in Germany, that would be my concern, because the permeability is a problem. So you actually have to do both. You have to do an apprenticeship and you have to do. So what's tending to happen is that young people are doing their bachelor degree and then they're doing an apprenticeship. So of course then that has a knockback effect. So those that traditionally would have just done the apprenticeship route are finding it harder to get their apprenticeship. and there's something called the transition system in Germany, which is what we very used to call very unkindly a warehousing system. In the 1970s, people remember the youth opportunities programs and things like that, where they're kind of in a holding place, sometimes for a number of years, doing courses and things like that until they can get an apprenticeship.
Mark Pippin, Nescott College, so I've been retired for a couple of years. In the past, I've been quite heavily involved in teaching apprentices, and one of the really important components of the course was in maths, English and IT, to do with key skills, which was later replaced by functional skills. Is that all gone now, or is that still a requirement?
It's a requirement under the current arrangements, yes.
Yeah, that's still going on.
Under the reform programme, it's still a requirement, but it's slightly less tied to qualification outcomes. The IT isn't a the IT is not a requirement, is it?
But English and maths are.
Yeah.
Okay, it is just about 1 o'clock. If we take a final question from Francis.
You hinted a little bit about the pay question, and I just wondered if you, in the remaining microseconds, you could say something about the debates about apprenticeship pay and whether the sorts of things you've been talking about today, do they impinge upon the low pay condition when they're deciding on minimum pay for apprenticeships? I don't hear very much about that. I'm interested.
The pay surveys, which have been conducted at regular intervals, are really interesting to look at, but they're distorted by this conversion issue. So the pay looks higher because nobody would agree to be converted to become a registered apprentice if it meant they had to take a pay cut. So you get people doing semi-skilled jobs, say, who are on their rate, whether it's £8 or £9 an hour, who then are registered as apprentices and look like they're on £8 or £9 an hour as an apprentice. So they get that, but you also get some other things happening at the low pay end. So young people, 16 to 18s, have to be paid the apprenticeship minimum wage, which is £2 something. I forget the exact details now. There may be somebody in the room who will know the exact figure. So that's obviously a low pay, very low pay, and is justified in the same way that low pay is justified in our neighbour countries. That it's low pay now, but you'll get high pay later on. But of course, we don't necessarily deliver that on that because we don't have the protected occupations with the wage premium for young people to go on to. So it's actually not such a convincing argument at all. But there's quite a bit written about pay, and it's a really interesting issue. But you have to go into it knowing about the conversion issue to understand why some of it looks quite high.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, can I test that? We find for small businesses that the majority of small businesses don't pay a basic wage, they pay a minimum wage for their apprentices. For those that do pay an apprenticeship wage, they often get caught out by the transition as they move up from 16, 17, 18 and then post-19 pay scale. So they have HMRC come down on them and say, look, you're doing something wrong here, and they turn around and say, we didn't know anything about it. So there's an element of confusion about the pay system as well, that businesses are getting hit unintentionally. So it's not, which creates bad publicity for small businesses. And I'm here to defend them, but it's a thing I think across the piece.
I'd like to defend small businesses. Most of them are honourable in respect to the fact an apprentice needs to be able to live, and they have the ambition to pay the minimum wage. Not all of them can afford it, so they do. Some of them start off with the apprenticeship wage, with the ambition to pay bonus payments and all sorts of incentives along the way. But yes, some do get caught out. But mostly, the practice is in London. It's about £200 take home on average a week for an apprentice at the moment.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone very much. Thanks, Alison.